100,000 cold cases in the United States. They won't be solved with CODIS alone.
In November of 1980, it's actually November 1st of 1980, the Sheriff's Department received a call from a trucker who was driving on Interstate 45, and he observed what he believed to be a body on the side of the road. When they got out there, they did find a female body. She was nude and appeared to have been sexually assaulted. There was only shoes with her. There was no other articles of clothing. The deputies went out there. They did what they could back in 1980, which, I mean, by today's standards, it's not a lot, but back then it was a lot. They collected the evidence that they had. They had the body taken off for autopsy. The body actually went down to Harris County Medical Examiners, and they performed the autopsy down there. While they were doing that, they started going around town because we didn't know who she was. They started making contact with people. They made contact with multiple people who said they had witnessed her or somebody matching her description at a truck stop, also at a diner. Some of the witnesses said that she had been asking for information on how to get to a local prison out here. There's multiple prisons in this area, but there was one in particular that they were asking about. So with that information, they went out and they started making contact with some of the prisons and just trying to find out if she'd been out there or anything along those lines. All those leads came up with nothing. In 1999, the case kind of picked back up when her body was exhumed, and they exhumed the body in 1999 so that we could perform DNA testing and possibly put her in CODIS, stuff along those lines. So they, along with University of North Texas, they went through, they collected some bones, reburied her body, and then had what they could sent off for DNA samples. 2014, 2015, I was assigned the case, and they identified the Golden State Killer. And when they identified the Golden State Killer, I went to my sergeant at the time and I told him, hey, they're doing this thing called familial DNA. Can we start looking into it? And from that point, they sent me to a couple classes. I learned a little bit more about familial DNA, found out what exactly we needed for familial DNA, and we didn't have it at the time. The only evidence that I could find at the time was a jawbone with some, it was a partial jawbone with some teeth. We had that shipped off to another lab in 2018. It was actually October 2018. And when we sent it off to that lab, we were, fingers crossed, let's get this done. Hopefully we can identify this girl and possibly identify her killer. But at the end of October, we got a letter back from that lab saying, hey, there's not enough here. They only got 0.05 nanograms and they needed 0.1 nanogram in order to actually get the right amount of DNA for what we needed done. So that kind of, blew a hole in everything. It breaks your heart. You don't want to give up, but it came down to we were going to have to go ahead and either exhume the body again or find more evidence.
I reached out to Detective Tom Bean and had a very good preliminary call with him just about Othram in general, what we do, how we do it, that we're located right down the street, and we'd love for him to come and visit the lab, discuss the case, and see if we could help.
They came down with the Texas Rangers and some other folks from other agencies, and we had a nice meeting at the Othram campus, took a tour of the lab. It's the only lab in the United States that does the work that we do completely end to end.
In this case specifically, privacy was a huge issue because the case was had so much public interest before it came to us. And because the case had failed testing previously, and the detectives were nervous about potentially failing testing again and not being able to solve it.
There was a lot of places that we could have gone. The main reason I went with Othram is because of the confidentiality that they have. They made me feel comfortable. They made me know that when I took this stuff to them, they weren't just going to go out and, hey, here it is, because this is a pretty high-profile case. We're a small town, but it's a high-profile case because of who it was.
They wanted to approach this case carefully and cautiously and conservatively, and they wanted to do that and feel like they had the time necessary to work the investigation to their standards. And so it was a requirement that if we were to be involved, that we maintained discretion, as most law enforcement will ask, and that we did everything in-house.
Being able to work on the entire process of this case allowed us to understand everything that was needed at each and every step, and be able to adopt our methods and our processes in order to best fit the evidence that we had, and in order to get the most value from that DNA and build a profile that had the most information so that we could provide an investigative lead to the detectives.
We started with skeletal remains in this case, and the remains had failed DNA extraction at numerous other locations. And when we tried to get a productive DNA extract from the skeletal remains, we also came into a lot of challenges. There was just no DNA.
We relayed that information back to the investigators, and at that time, they were pretty confident that there was other evidence out there, but it had to be tracked down. There was some confusion of where it might be. And so there was kind of an investigation within the investigation to find this additional evidence that we could look at.
Myself and a Texas Ranger, after we found out that, hey, this isn't going to work, we went and had a meeting down at Harris County Medical Examiners. And just, do you have anything? Is there any evidence left from the autopsy? Is there anything left at all? And come to find out, they had some paraffin blocks that were saved from the autopsy. And when we were down there, the doctors told us, they said, absolutely not. You're never going to get anything from this. Paraffin destroys everything that it has. It's mainly there just for a sample.
The problem with that DNA is that the tissue was basically formalin fixed and paraffin embedded, which is a fancy way of saying it was chemically preserved, which allows you to look at the tissue later on, if you ever want to, under a microscope. Preserves all the parts of the material really nice for decades. The downside is that in that preservation process, everything is dehydrated and fixed into place, and along with it is the DNA. And if you try to reconstitute it and dissociate the DNA from the other parts, you end up with a big mess. And so it's very challenging to not get DNA, but to get DNA that is useful and I guess what I would say sequenceable from FFPE blocks. And so we were able to do it ultimately, but it did take a little bit of work. And there were both modifications of the laboratory process, but also at the informatic process to make that happen.
Often they performed a miracle. I mean, it's all you can say. Everybody said it can't be done, and they did it. And they called me and they gave me a list of 6 names. Said these are going to be possibly her grandparents. These are going to be either direct family members or like cousins or something along with aunts and uncles, something along those lines. It's up to you to fill in the rest.
He went off and did what he does best, really good police work and investigative work, and was able to figure out that those people were indeed related to Sherri.
Sherri's biological brother provided us with a DNA sample that he actually sent us 4 swabs. We sent 2 to Othram and 2 to University of North Texas, because in these cases, they prefer you to have a CODIS hit or a CODIS match of some sort. So we shipped those off. Othram was able to come back pretty quick and say, yeah, this is going to be a brother.
PRC2's Lauren Freeman is live in the newsroom with a look at what was revealed today and where the investigation goes from here. Lauren?
Christine, the young woman, was just 14 years old when she was killed. Her name, Sherri Ann Jarvis. She arrived in Huntsville.
There are certain things about this case that have never been made public. And if we can confirm some of those things, then, hopefully it'll lead to a suspect and getting somebody either put in jail, or at the minimum, just we know who he is and he's dead, or we know who she is and she's dead. Something, we want to find some sort of closure.
If you want to learn more, come to DNAsolves.com, DNASOLVES.com. There's cases that need funding support. You can donate your DNA to help solve the next crime, or you can share some of the stories that we've announced with law enforcement.